I've worked in the criminal justice system for 10 years. As a sexual offences prosecutor, my days have been spent seeing the aftermath of sexual violence, case after case after case. I work for an institution that can only respond to sexual violence one case at a time, and only after the damage has been done. Often, I feel impotent because no matter what I do in court, I can never reach back in time and undo what's happened. More than half of young Australian women will have experienced sexual violence by the time they're in their 20s, and more than half will have been sexually harassed since the age of 15. It's 1 in 20 for men. The devastation that this wreaks can be ruinous. Feeling frustrated by the limits of the criminal justice system, by 2019 I decided to fully focus on sexual violence prevention. It seemed the only solution to slow the steady stream of devastating, life-ruining case files hitting my desk. Consent education held the promise of a magical solution, a silver bullet to stop or reduce sexual violence.
So this is Katrina Marson, and I'm really privileged to have her on the podcast today. Katrina, that TEDx talk was just amazing, and I was really delighted to be able to see it. I'm going to put a link below about it so other people can see it if they haven't. But welcome, Katrina Marson. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a privilege for me, so I'm delighted to have you with us on No Sex Please, I'm Religious. Goodness, I had to even think of what the name of the talk was about. So your LinkedIn profile says these things about you. It says, and you may have put them there yourself or someone else may have done them for you, but it's pretty impressive. Author, lawyer, speaker, Churchill Fellow, columnist, TEDx talker, author of Legitimate Sexpectations, The Power of Sex Ed, Scribe 2022, former criminal lawyer with a decade of experience, particularly in sexual offences and family violence, including in sexual offence law reform and policy. Academic qualifications focused on the law, sexuality and education. Churchill Fellowship researched the implementation of relationships and sexuality education to safeguard sexual well-being. And that was all part of the TEDx talk in Brisbane. Now, what amazes me, and are you still a tutor in evidence law and criminal law at ANU?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Oh, fantastic. For those who might be watching or listening from overseas, that's Australian National University in Canberra. And you served 5 years on the board of the Canberra Rape Crisis Centre.
Yes.
Wow, Katrina, that's amazing. And you don't look anything as old as you need to be to have done all that.
I'll certainly take that compliment.
All right, good on you. So what can I ask you, what started you along this journey? Because it's quite an amazing journey.
Well, I became interested in the power of education to prevent sexual violence when I did my honours thesis at ANU, right at the end of my qualifications and right before I went to practice in the criminal justice system as a lawyer. In my honours thesis, I compared the ability of the criminal justice system to prevent sexual violence compared to the power of education. And the evidence and the research is fairly clear that education is a much more effective measure at that than the tertiary responsive mechanism that is the criminal law. But nonetheless, I went to serve the criminal justice system as soon as I'd graduated, and I was there for another 10 years in various capacities, predominantly as a prosecutor, predominantly in the area of sexual offences. But I did also work at legal aid, so I've represented people who've been accused of sexual offences. And as you mentioned, I also did policy work where I implemented the criminal justice recommendations of the Child Abuse Royal Commission here in the ACT. So it's given me a bit of a bird's eye view, I suppose, of the criminal justice system, seeing it from all those different angles and with that particular focus on sexual offences. And I never forgot what I learned when I did my honours thesis about the failings of the criminal justice system to actually stop this from happening in the first place.
Yeah.
And that became only more important to me as I worked in an institution that can only respond one case at a time. and it doesn't always respond for everyone. And so it became ever more important to me that we focus on preventing sexual violence from happening in the first place. So I turned back to education that held this promise of protection and prevention. And that's when my Churchill Fellowship took place. In 2019, I travelled, and I really got a chance to explore the implementation of this kind of education in other countries and see what they were doing well that we could learn from here in Australia. And that just started me, or sort of kick-started that journey again, in that focus on sex education, and the rest is history.
Oh, look, that's well, I'm sure we're going to explore more of that as we talk today. But working for those 10 years, you must have heard, there must have been many stories that were very hard for you to carry. Sharing the pain of other people's lives and trying to respond and protect people and so on. And you would have been, I imagine, fairly young going through all that. So how did that, can I ask you, how did it affect your mental health?
Yes, you can ask me. And I think it's a really important question, because it's really important that we talk about the role of vicarious trauma for those who work in this area. That was significant. It's no easy thing to hear the stories of the worst moments in people's lives, the worst things that people have done, and to try and navigate a system that is hostile to everyone. And to try and achieve justice in a system that so rarely delivers it. That's a very heavy job. And it did take a toll. And I wonder sometimes, well, I don't wonder, I have recognized that my interest in sex education and the prevention of sexual violence and giving future generations a better chance than the rest of us have had, is a bit of an act of self-care, because it allowed me, particularly when I was still working in the criminal justice system, so I'm taking a break at the moment to do my PhD, but when I was still working in it, it allowed me something hopeful to focus on.
Yes.
And I realized that I really needed that, because it's a brutal system and a brutal job otherwise, because you can feel completely impotent. And as I said in the TED Talk, it doesn't matter what you do in the pursuit of justice. At the end of the day, you can't actually undo the fact that it's happened to someone. And that is freshly painful every time.
Katrina, it's a very, very important role that you are playing. The research that you've done is so important. As you know, this podcast is about religion's role in creating sex shame, whereby the issues are not talked about. This is such a central part of humanity. You can't get away from it. But shame is such a big thing, and you see it even in Africa, where I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised to discover from one of my Ugandan friends who's now in America that the custom was for girls to hear about sex, to get the sex talk from an aunt. And I said to him, well, why doesn't the mother do that? And his words were simply, well, she's too ashamed to. So, why should we be ashamed? This is just who we are, how our bodies function and how life functions. And then I said, well, what about boys? How do boys learn? And lo and behold, it was the same as in most countries of the world. It was, peers at school and, things that they'd found on the internet or, porn or whatever. And so what chance have people got? So I'm intrigued, having listened to your TED Talk, which we saw a tiny bit of before, why consent education isn't enough. And I've got to say to you, I found it challenging and exciting, and a very important presentation for all Australian kids, my grandkids, Americans, people in Britain, Europe, and of course Africa and Asia, and of course the islands as well. Now, as I said earlier, I will include a link below, and I strongly encourage people to watch that. But the question I'd like you to sort of unpack for me, because you used the expression of sexual well-being, and that sexual well-being was in a sense more important or goes hand in hand with sex education. And to be honest, that is something that we've sort of been working towards, but we didn't have a name for it. So I'd love to hear more.
Sexual well-being is such a fundamental part of the story of sexuality and rights and the right to self-determination and the role of education in all of that when we're thinking about relationships and sexuality education. When I talk about sexual well-being, as you will hear in the TED Talk, I talk about the fact that sometimes people are a bit perturbed by that expression. They think that it refers to sexual pleasure. I've been asked, when I talk about the right to sexual well-being, I've been asked, well, is there a right to sex? And that there really lies the confusion.
Yeah.
Sexual well-being is not the same as sex or sexual activity. Sexual well-being is just as we would understand mental well-being, physical well-being, other kinds of well-being, it is that holistic well-being pertaining to your sexuality. So if, for example, you are asexual, you have no sexual desire, no sexual interest whatsoever, your sexual well-being, you still have a right to sexual well-being. It's just that your sexual well-being looks like something that doesn't include sexual activity that you have no interest in.
That's right.
So that's how I would explain what sexual well-being is. It's about understanding, being given the skills and tools to explore what your sexuality means for you, what it looks like to feel healthy, happy, thriving with respect to your sexuality, your intimate relationships, however that might work for you. So it's not just about pleasure, although for many people, of course, it would include pleasure, but it's not just about that. It also includes freedom from violence and harassment and harm and illness and shame. And I talk about this extensively in my book, in Legitimate Sexpectations, what sexual well-being includes and doesn't include. But it's really important that we think about the right to that well-being for all people and acknowledge that to achieve that, you need to have education and information about what sex and intimate relationships can look like, what might be something that you're interested in, sexually speaking, what your rights are, what your choices are. There are certain things that if we don't even know their choices, it can't be said that we are choosing when it comes to the question of consent, if we don't know that we actually have a choice or a right to do one thing or another. So that's the role of sexual well-being. And I know what you're talking about when you say it's something that you've been working towards, but you haven't had the language for. That was the same as me. Sexual well-being is something that is discussed in international sexual health spheres. And certainly the World Association for Sexual Health, for example, really tries to promote the idea or spread the idea of sexual well-being and its importance alongside things like sexual justice and sexual rights. But it's language that we're not really familiar with because, just as you say, we don't tend to talk about sex very much at all. And so, of course, we can't get to the nuanced level of talking about sexual well-being if we can barely even talk about sex for the purposes of trying to dissuade teenagers from getting pregnant or getting STIs. We can barely even talk about it there, let alone, as I say, that more nuanced side of things.
Yeah. I find when you look at, Africa or other countries, other nations of the world, in Africa, there are the number of children who are produced from relationships that were never meant to be permanent. So people get their information in the ways that we've described, and things happen, sex happens, and a girl gets pregnant. Sometimes the father may be a gay man, a young man who's gay, and he knows that there's no place in that society for him as a gay person. So he's trying to present himself as not being gay. And so some of the people that we've supported have children that they love and they want to care for, but it was never planned, and all because of lack of understanding and shame being the cause of all these things. So all of that really does fascinate me, and I'm so glad to be talking to you today.
Sorry, David, I just want to add to that and say, yeah, there's certainly, I think worldwide, all over the world, we see the ripple effect of our failures to give generations of young people education and information that would help them safeguard their own sexual well-being and make autonomous decisions that you can't make without that information. And it's not, it's all over the world. We see it here in Australia. We see it in places that I visited on my Churchill Fellowship, even where they do have good sex education. By our standards, by Australian standards, I would look at the Netherlands, for example, and think, gee, they're streets ahead of us, but they still see that they have a long way to go. And I'd have to say there are places in Africa, in South America, for example, that really lead the way when it comes to sex education.
Yeah.
We see this all over the world. There are examples of extremely good work at a grassroots level, even at a state level. For example, I know that Nigeria has done some really good things in the space of sex ed, for example. But then elsewhere you see the failings of other parts of society to really embrace sex education and really make sure that they're guaranteeing young people access to sex ed. And I'd say that about Australia. We cannot say that every Australian is guaranteed access to comprehensive sex education, not by country mile.
No, and unfortunately, you end up with conservative people who, get scared of the S word and start to oppose those who are trying to change things. Do you have much opposition in what you're doing, in your talks and so on?
Not so much in the talks that I've given. I do confront opposition. We see it in the sex ed space all over the world. Again, even in places where they're further ahead than us. So recently, for example, the Netherlands has experienced quite an organised mis and disinformation campaign about some of their long celebrated, highly regarded sex education courses. And this is a country where they have a pretty good sex ed policy and they have a pretty good history of sex ed for a big proportion of their community. So even in countries like that, you're still going to face opposition. It's not something that we need to be scared off by, because we're going to get it. We just need to be prepared for it. I certainly do experience it. It can come from predictable places. It can come from unpredictable places. So yeah, it's just part of the work, and being prepared for it, being prepared to meet it, and having the courage to meet it. And I say that particularly from a political perspective. Politicians need to have the courage to meet that opposition head on and stand on the evidence that actually this education safeguards well-being, and that not giving it to young people is what puts them in harm's way.
Courage and commitment to rational thought in these areas is so important, isn't it? Katrina, my day job at this point is working with people with disabilities. And one of the things that I've learned in the more than a decade that I've been working in this area is that there are lots of areas where, with people who don't have disabilities, you can moralize in different ways. Okay, this is appropriate, this isn't appropriate, all the rest of it. But when you're dealing with people with disabilities, and I'm not saying moralize necessarily in a good sense. I'm just saying that, that you can make people behave in certain ways because of, fear and control and so on. When you're working with people with intellectual disabilities who are, for the most part, childlike, you really can't. And you discover at times, I mean, I've had to confront sexual misbehavior, what we would call sexual misbehavior from people who have disabilities. But on the one hand, you're looking at someone who has certain desires, whatever they are, okay, And society has not recognized that, you know.
Yes.
You're not
Yes.
going to lose, the person's not going to lose them. So what you're trying to do is to help them, you know, survive in a society and do what is acceptable for everybody, you know, and not cause harm. But what I'm thinking, it's a long lead up here, but I'm thinking how difficult it is in the courts for someone who has to go and tell their story of rape or abuse or whatever, and sometimes the case of even the perpetrator may be nuanced as well as you've represented perpetrators. How much more so is it for somebody who has a disability? And I'm sure we have people in prisons who have had disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and society has made no provision for who they are and how they respond to life.
So I want to answer that in two different respects. First, with respect to your question as it pertains to the criminal justice system and our responses to sexual violence there, and then I also want to talk about sex education and people with disabilities.
Yeah.
When it comes to the criminal justice system, when you are trying to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone sexually assaulted someone, you have to prove the relevant, what we call the mental elements, which are that they knew or were reckless that the other person was not consenting, so that they had to have intended to engage in the sexual conduct, and they have to have known or been reckless that the other person was not consenting. If they genuinely but mistakenly believe that the other person was consenting, in certain jurisdictions now you can look at whether that belief was reasonably held.
Okay.
So someone's intellectual disability would undoubtedly come into play in the consideration of the mental element that they had when it comes to whether they knew or were reckless or reasonably believed that the other person was consenting. On the other hand, we know that people with disabilities are a lot more likely to experience sexual violence
Yes, absolutely.
than those without disabilities.
Yeah.
So the interaction between the criminal justice system and those with disabilities when it comes to sexual violence has a number of additional nuanced factors than for the population without disability.
Yeah.
Can I come to sex education and disability?
Yes.
We, just as you alluded to, we are so bad as a community at recognizing the right to sexual well-being altogether. And we are particularly bad at recognizing that all of us hold the right to sexual well-being. And that includes people with disability. They have a right to sexual well-being. And what we tend to do when it comes to sex education is leave kids with disabilities out, because either we treat them as asexual or we infantilize them, or we suggest that they will never have relationships or that they never should. These are all incredibly patronizing, paternalistic and unhelpful, to say the least, approaches to sex education when it comes to people with disabilities. There are so many people out there who have designed excellent sex ed resources and programs for kids with disabilities. It is an absolute dereliction of our duty as a society that we fail to deliver sex education at all, but particularly the way that we leave disabled kids out. So it's really, really important that we do just as you're alluding to. We do recognize that sexual well-being is something that we all have a right to, and how we give people access to information and education that they need in order to achieve that right, in order to achieve the self-determination that everyone's entitled to, just means we need to consider how we deliver that education, how we ensure it based on the population and the audience that we're trying to give it to.
Yeah. And you say in the talk, of course, you quote the United Nations Declaration of Sexual Rights, which well, I haven't given you the correct term for it, but it's so important. I recently interviewed Fiona Patten. Are you aware of Fiona Patten? She was the Victorian Member of Parliament who was co-founder of the Sex Party that became the Reason Party. Now she in her book about going from being a sex worker to a member of parliament, which is quite amazing, she actually talked about, gave a whole chapter to a woman who she became friends with who had cerebral palsy. And Fiona was the only person that she could actually talk openly to about her sexual desires. You know, it was her right, and nobody else was recognizing it. So Fiona managed to get a sex worker in, and this was probably before the NDIS changed the rules to allow for sex workers for people where needed, which I find an interesting phrase. And she also assisted her, and this changed the lady's psychology, her mental health immensely. You know, she started to feel better about herself, and then Fiona actually bought a vibrator for her, and all the workers at the time were asked to do was to put it in reach of her, because she was, you know, unable to get around and all that sort of thing. And they refused to do it. Now, I don't believe that would happen now. This is probably 10 or 12 years ago, but no, hang on, that's not right. I'm sure it's happening in all kinds of places. And it just makes me very angry because, you know, as you say, we need to recognize everyone has rights.
Yeah. I have a whole chapter in my book dedicated to sex education and people with disabilities. And it is exactly, you can see that all over the world, that paternalism, that sort of running interference, and that denial of the right to sexual well-being. And I agree with you, it's egregious.
Katrina, how is your, well, I've asked you the question about opposition to what you do and the pushback you receive. Again, coming back to Fiona Patten, it was her party which was the first to call for a royal commission into child sex abuse. And, you know, when you think of all those wonderful Catholics out there in politics and the wonderful evangelical or Pentecostal Christians, you'd think or Buddhists or Muslims or people of no faith at all. Yeah, we should all have been calling out that horrible abuse, shouldn't we? Can I ask you just to finish, because I want to keep this reasonably short. There's so much more we can talk about, but what I'd like to ask you is, have you done any research, or are you familiar with the connection between sex shame and mental health?
I haven't personally done any research into it, but it is clear that shame and taboo and silence around sex and sexuality contributes to the proliferation of child sexual abuse, difficulties in healthy sex lives, in pursuing sexual well-being. We know that it's an inhibitor, and we know that it's really rife. And it's because it's so deep-seated. We're talking about generations of people who haven't had good sex education, who have lived under the spectre of shame when it comes to sex and sexuality. And it doesn't just come from religion, although many of the religions certainly bang that drum. And I was raised Catholic, so I'm familiar with the Catholic doctrine and the rhetoric, I suppose, around this stuff.
Yeah.
At least formally. So it's certainly something that persists and that we need to try and break down because, as I say, shame and secrecy and silence is what allows abuse, exploitation, negative sexual experiences to flourish. So we really need to work to try and mitigate that. That said, to perhaps give a little bit of hope as we approach the end of this conversation, I can say that there are plenty of religious individuals, bodies, organizations, leaders out there who understand and recognize the importance of this work and are
That
doing
is
what they
true.
can
That
to
is true.
actually push forward in a way that doesn't, still aligns with the pillars
Yeah.
of their faith, but
Yes.
in a way that does not deny young people the information and education they need. I work with Catholic schools that are really doing good work to try and get their students the education they need without diverging entirely from the principles of their faith. And the other thing that I'd like to point out is I was recently involved in some research about parental support for relationships and sex education in Australian schools. And the level of support among Australian parents for better sex ed in schools is enormously high, nearly
Wonderful.
90%.
Wonderful.
You
That's
don't get
amazing.
you don't get those kind of rates
Wow.
in research. 90% is huge. And that support crosses religious and political lines.
Yeah.
So we know that parents with kids in Catholic schools, parents who are more conservative voters, all still support better sex ed in schools very strongly.
Yeah.
So we should have hope that that there is a vast majority of Australians that see how we need to move forward in this space and what young people are entitled to and what they deserve, notwithstanding perhaps the what we might assume or predict about their ideologies based on their religious or their political
Yes.
affiliations.
Yeah, look, thank you for saying that, because we're certainly not. I'm certainly not a religion basher. I have quite a strong religious background, and I was delighted recently to see the photo of the Pope entertaining some trans people around a table for afternoon tea or whatever it was, and I did have one of my conservative friends say, well, he hoped he was going to try and help them, which in his line of thinking would have been quite different to mine. Helping would be teach them how wrong they are and how they should behave themselves, which is awful. Katrina, it's been really lovely talking to you. I really encourage you in your work, and I believe that some of the people who are deeply traumatized in Africa that we are trying to help will be encouraged to watch this or hear this, to know that there's some good things happening in some parts of the world where they can be recognized and appreciated for who they are.
And I would say including in, as I said, including in Africa, including in South America, there is really great
There's some
work
good
happening there
things,
too.
great things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't mean to say earlier, of course, that in Uganda was doing really well. I mean, my focus is mainly Uganda and Kenya and some eastern states, which are not good things are not necessarily happening. But in Uganda, they made some wonderful progress with the AIDS virus, and that was because they were talking about it, and it was being talked about from pulpits and what we would call town squares and all the rest of it. But that has been turned around because of the condemning conservative movements there. So, which is very sad. Katrina, thank you once again for joining me today. And I look forward to talking to you again and watching your career, because it's very, very important stuff you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me, David. And if, as you said, there's so much more we could talk about. So if you ever want to have me on for part 2, just send me an email.
I'm sure I will, and I'll be back in touch with you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Thank you so much.